In 1833, William Foster Lloyd, a distinguished British academic, observed that when a common pasture can be used by anyone to graze cows, the pasture will be overused and lost to all. The cost of use is externalized to everybody, but the benefits are not. This famous parable is generally referred to as the tragedy of the commons. It demonstrates how access to a common resource, such as a pasture or a public treasury, ultimately dooms the resource because of overexploitation. This important concept of exploitation, getting benefits and externalizing the cost of those benefits, applies to government, politics, and society as well. A tax takes money away from individual people and makes it part of the commons, available to all. Private property is thereby socialized. Regulations similarly take property rights from individuals. For example, zoning laws limit an owner in the use of his property. Every law steals choices and imposes the choices of those who make the laws. Legislation always compels obedience and limits individual freedom. Margaret Thatcher, a former British Prime Minister, explained the tragedy of the commons a little differently. To quote her, "The trouble with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money," unquote. You see, under various Labour governments, Britain socialized much of its economy from private control. By the 70s, tragedy finally struck. Britain ran out of money. Conditions were dire. During this time, known as the Winter of Discontent, the Labour Party finally lost appeal for enough voters to let the Conservative Party again govern. Margaret Thatcher was chosen by that party to fix the problems. She began to once again privatize state-owned companies and deregulate the economy. Conditions in the US were similar at about the same time, culminating in stagflation. This led to the election of Republican Ronald Reagan as president. He famously said, quote, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." Let me mention one more Brit, Sir John Dalberg Acton, who remarked, quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Government power is no exception. We observe corrupt government regularly here in New York State. But New York is also no exception. Government socializes money from we the people into the common treasury and gives it to people who are more politically connected. Legislators essentially buy votes with other people's money. They promise stuff by getting money from those who want the favors, campaign contributions, for example, and or promise to fund favors with money from government treasuries. The reality is votes can be bought and power can be sold. Legislators understand this reality. Power corrupts. the greater their power to create rights, dispense privileges, contracts, or favors, the higher the price such officials command. This is the dynamic that drives politics as usual, to grant the demands of some at the expense of others. Voting groups use politics to legislate themselves money and privileges. Frederick Bastiat, the 19th century French classical liberal thinker, also has some prescient advice. Quote, "Government is the great fiction through which everybody endeavors to live at the expense of everybody else." Unquote. And a corollary, quote, "When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves in the course of time a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it." The politics of expanding government creates growing institutional complexity and costs as well. The Upside of Down is a book which describes the process of increasing complexity, adding fixed costs to the system, and the way in which this diminishes returns. More and more labor, capital, and resources must be devoted to maintain system structure. At some point, the yield is negative. Input costs are higher than output. We can see this now with interest rates. Central banks are beginning to impose negative interest rates. This means savers are charged interests for their money instead of getting paid interest for their money. At that point, systems start unraveling, and people simply abandon costly, complex systems because the means to support them are no longer readily available. They begin to become unsustainable. This is similar to John Michael Greer's process of catabolic collapse, in which costly, complex systems go through a reset to a much lower energy consumption and less complexity. Then the system stabilizes at that lower level for a time. And then as costs rise and resources dwindle, it goes through another downsizing. This might be thought of as a business cycle as well. When the treasuries are empty of tax money, borrowing can still balance budgets. So, legislators actually buy votes with tax money to be collected from future generations, from our children and grandchildren. If neither the present or future citizens are able or capable of paying for current promised legislation benefits, legislators can distort the fiscal facts with smoke and mirror accounting tricks, and by just printing the money, essentially counterfeiting. But eventually, tragedy strikes. Reality can then no longer be shifted or ignored. Has this time of reckoning come for your community? That which cannot be paid will not be paid. The reality is your community government has consumed too much for too long. Your community pasture was overused. Grazing is now no longer possible by anyone. Tragedy is struck. You face bankruptcy. You don't want to pay the required taxes, and your creditors don't want to lend you any more money. You're not alone. Lots of municipalities have reached that point of tragedy.